Hello, welcome. Glad you're here. In this video, we're going to talk about the differences between cycling and running, which may at face value seem somewhat interchangeable, but there are some relevant differences that are important to understand if you want to make the most effective use of your time spent training. So, as always, here is the plan for the video. We'll first go over some of the more granular differences that are inherent to the exercises themselves. We'll then go over what those differences mean, actually putting all that into practice. I'll attempt to summarize the entire video with just a few 4 or 5 bullet point sentences. And then, as always, the accompanying article with all of the references linked next to the claims that they seek to support will be linked down below. So, as far as the actual mechanical differences between cycling and running, the most important and also the most obvious is the presence or absence of impact during exercise. Running is obviously high, not just high impact, but also high volume of impact, and cycling has no impact at all. And this makes running a more intense exercise than cycling. And the reason is because impact necessitates eccentric muscle contractions. An eccentric contraction is the way your muscle contracts when it is lowering a weight. So if you imagine a squat, the way down when your muscles are lengthening and you're lowering the weight is an eccentric muscle contraction. And the way up when your muscles are shortening and you're actually lifting the weight is a concentric muscle contraction. As a general rule of thumb, eccentric muscle contractions are more intense, cause more muscle damage, and require more recovery than concentric muscle contractions. So if you did, again, let's say a set of bicep curls, and you did one set where you only did the way up part and another set where you only did the way down part. The set where you only did the way down, the controlling down of the weight, is going to cause more muscle damage and require more recovery than the only on the way up set. When you are running, every time your foot lands, your body has to perform an eccentric muscle contraction in order to accept the weight and sort of soften that landing and allow for that rebound up to propel you forward and produce more steps. This then occurs over the thousands of steps that take place in a run. Conversely, with cycling, there is no point in the exercise where you have to accept weight or lower any weight. There is only concentric muscle contractions. Thus, it is for this reason that running is a higher intensity exercise than cycling. And then as far as what muscles are being worked in each exercise, there really isn't all of that much difference between the two. The only real thing worth noting here is that with cycling, you spend more time in hip flexion, and running, you spend more time in hip extension. And hip flexion is just when your knee goes closer to your chest. Hip extension is where your knee goes the other direction, away from your chest towards or when your hips straighten out, so to speak. But again, apart from that, the main and really only really relevant mechanical difference between cycling and running is this presence and or absence of impact, which again contributes to the idea of running being more intense than cycling. Now, when you are running, your upper body is actually pretty highly active throughout the entire exercise session because it is acting as a counterweight, providing momentum to the lower body, therefore increasing your speed without your legs having to work that much harder. Cycling is almost exclusively lower body and almost 0% upper body. And this is especially true of stationary cycling. Now, there's 4 sort of hallmark ways in which your body adapts to cardio, to aerobic exercise, insofar as how it gets better at doing so. Now, the details here aren't super worth going over. I have a lot of other content where I do that. The main point here is that 2 of these adaptations occur across the entire body, no matter what type of exercise you're using, whether it's swimming, whether it's cycling, or whatever else. And the other 2 only occur in the muscles being worked for the exercise. So both of the systemic full body adaptations will be achieved with running and cycling. That you can rest assured of. Both running and cycling will also produce the local specific to the muscle adaptations in the lower body, but only running will produce the local adaptations in the upper body. In other words, in some sense, running gives you more of a full body aerobic adaptation, where cycling is more of a specific targeted local aerobic adaptation. Now, this graph is going to answer probably the most common question I get with regard to the difference between running and cycling, and that is why heart rate targets for running don't feel the same as they do when you are cycling. And the reason why is that the purpose of using heart rate to guide your training is to estimate where you are on this graph during exercise. So as you perform exercise, your body produces these compounds called lactate and acid, or lactic acid, which is then converts into lactate and acid in isolation. As exercise intensity increases, the production and the rate of production of lactate and acid also increase. This increase in lactate and acid can inhibit further energy production and inhibit further muscle contraction, and is what largely contributes to the fatigue felt over an exercise session. Now, there's 2 points on this graph that are particularly relevant, at least, are commonly understood to be relevant. That's the first lactate threshold and the second lactate threshold. Now, the first lactate threshold is usually said to be around 2 millimoles of lactate per liter of blood, and once you cross this point of intensity, the rate at which lactate and acid is being accumulated in the muscle and in the blood is itself increasing. And then this happens again at the second lactate threshold, which is usually said to be around 4 millimoles of lactate per liter of blood. This is a little off. This should be a bit lower. It's usually around 4. Training underneath this first lactate threshold is usually described as easy. Training between the first and the second lactate threshold is usually described as being moderate intensity. And training past this second lactate threshold is usually described as being hard to very hard. Usually once you're past this point, you're lasting 4 minutes and then your body's going to hit fatigue. You can't really physiologically sustain much more than that once you're past this point. If you're familiar with the concept of, let's say, zone 2 cardio, which has really just become increasingly popular over the past, let's say, 5 years or so, the purpose of zone 2 cardio is to put you directly beneath this first lactate threshold, but not past it. What's really important to understand here is that this increase in blood lactate and acid in response to exercise intensity is a local phenomenon, but heart rate is a systemic full body measurement. Because during running, your body has to pump blood to a wider area of your body, again, because it's pumping a lot of blood to your upper body as well, because your upper body is being very active during running, your heart rate is going to be higher while you are lower on this graph. Conversely, while you're cycling, because your body only really has to pump blood to your lower body, I mean, obviously it's still pumping blood to your upper body, but the increase in blood allocation occurs mostly in the lower body. You're going to rise on this graph at lower heart rates than you would for running. And it's for this reason that, let's say, 140 beats per minute probably feels somewhat easy while you're running, but that probably feels really hard while you're cycling. And again, because at 140 beats per minute while running, you're probably around this first lactate threshold right here, but you might be near the second one while cycling. So all that really to say that heart rate targets are specific to the mode of exercise you're doing, and they can't really be transferred from one mode of exercise to another. The rate at which you progress in exercise is ultimately going to dictate the results you see, whether how good or bad they are, and the injury risk you incur, with both a too slow and too fast rate of progression being equally somewhat problematic. However, the room you have to progress with running versus cycling is very different, and that's largely due to the presence or lack of impact for the same reasons we talked about at the beginning of this video. So to make all that a little more real, for any exercise, a short-term high spike in volume that you do is usually the number one predictor of whether or not you're going to see an injury or at least incur a increased risk of injury. For running, injury risk usually tends to notably increase when you run 10% longer than the longest run that you've ran in the last 30 days. For cycling, injury risk doesn't tend to become too crazy until you exceed 30% or so. So this plays a pretty important role when you think about how quickly you can progress week to week without or with incurring any real risk of injury. If you take a more long-term chronic sort of view to this, the same sort of relationship tends to pan out. So I like to use the relationship between these two forms of exercise and osteoarthritis, which is the most typical form of arthritis people talk about when they say arthritis, because I think it paints the picture pretty well. So recreational runners, people who are, let's say, running, but their livelihood does not depend on it, that's somewhat of an important distinction here, typically have a third of the risk of osteoarthritis compared to people who do not run. Professional runners, though, and again, think of people for whom running is their source of livelihood, those individuals tend to have a slightly increased risk of osteoarthritis compared to non-runners. So in other words, running in general reduces your risk of osteoarthritis until it is pushed to the absolute highest level. For cycling, there is no reverse of effect that has been observed, at least to my knowledge. Most of the evidence in this regard will say that the more cycling a person does across their lifetime, the lower their risk of osteoarthritis. So again, there's another of different sort of conditions and things that we can view this lens through, but the same relationship tends to pan out. You can do too much of either for the most part, but it is much harder to do too much with cycling than it is with running. That should be a T right there. But again, cycling overall is more forgiving than running. And as far as progressing running, you do need to be a bit more thought out and targeted and specific with how you progress that over time. Now, if we had to say which one is better just for cardio, for building endurance, for building aerobic fitness, I tend to use those terms somewhat interchangeably. It's first worth acknowledging that endurance is task specific. Anything is task specific. I mean, strength is too. Someone who is a really good swimmer is going to be said to have really good endurance, but that's not going to translate to them being a great runner, so to speak. If I had to pick which is going to be best for just general development of your aerobic system, I would say doing both across the week is going to be better than only running, which is going to be better than only cycling. And the reason why is really twofold. So one, running, again, is more full body than cycling. So those local adaptations that only occur in the muscles being worked are going to occur across the entire body for the most part. And again, running is higher intensity at baseline. It is easier to hit your maximum heart rate with running than it is with cycling. And now you shouldn't spend too much time at your maximum heart rate, but you should spend some time at your max heart rate in order to really have the best cardiovascular gains possible over time. Now, the reason why I tend to opt or recommend both over either alone is because one, you'll get all the benefits of running if running is part of the program. You'll most likely feel much less fatigued, beat down, run down, all that sort of stuff across the week when you have a combination strategy as opposed to only running. And that can lend to not just you feeling better day to day, but also making this easier to combine with strength training or other modes of training. Again, it's easier to force more volume of cycling than it is with running. So you might be at a point where you've hit your volume of running for the week that makes sense for you, that will keep you safe and keep your risk of injury low. But you might be able to force more volume of cycling and push those aerobic adaptations more than if you were only running. Because again, you have more wiggle room with cycling. And then just in my own experience, all of my clients who are, I would say, high level runners, people who are competing regularly in 50-mile plus events, they perform and feel better when they do a bit less running and a bit more cycling, meaning running isn't the only form of endurance training they're doing. As far as which is going to be better for weight loss, fat loss, stuff like that, because it is a sort of question that comes up quite often, the best evidence does support that lifting and cardio concurrently, combined across the week, does produce the best results as far as body composition goes in terms of muscle mass to body fat ratio. And of course, there are some other required conditions for weight loss or fat loss to occur, one of which is being a calorie deficit, meaning you consume less calories than your body burns per day, usually 5 to 10% or 250 to 500 calories burned in excess to what you eat. Another one is sufficient protein, which is usually 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram. And in grams per pound body weight, that would be 0.7 to 1 grams of protein per pound of body weight. And then as far as the remaining details for proper exercise training for body composition specifically, I do have a whole other article video on that. I'll link that down below if you're interested in that. So again, the best evidence supports that lifting and cardio combined is your best bet for the best body composition results possible. As far as your cardio selection, I'm never going to say there's a wrong answer for what you do as long as you're doing something, but running does tend to outperform cycling. And I say this for a few reasons. One, because it is higher intensity than cycling, there is going to be a higher calorie burn per unit of time while you're doing the exercise. And two, even when you match calories burned in a session, so there's some studies where people will run or they'll cycle and they'll match the calories burned in any given exercise session. Those who perform the running tend to see a greater loss of abdominal fat, in other words, fat around your waist, and see a greater loss in visceral fat, which is fat around your organs, so to speak. Again, though, my rank order would be the same, where both is better than doing only running, which is better than doing only cycling, for much of the same reasons that I mentioned in the previous slide. So in an effort to sum up the entire video that we've talked about thus far, running is more intense than cycling due to the eccentric muscle contractions, which are as a result of the impact that occurs during the exercise. Running involves more upper body than cycling, which lends to the idea that those local aerobic adaptations will occur across the entire body, where in cycling, they will only occur in the legs. Your lactate thresholds are achieved at lower heart rates in cycling versus running. So if you try to translate the same heart rate targets used for running to cycling, you'll end up smoking your legs in a session that probably shouldn't have felt too hard. Cycling is much more forgiving than running as far as how fast you progress. So with running, you do need to be a bit more calculated, thought out, and strategic with how you progress that over time. For building endurance, doing both across the week is going to be better than only running, which is going to be better than only cycling. And for weight loss and fat loss, my answer for that is going to be the same. So with that said, I'm going to end this video here. I hope you find that somewhat helpful, interesting, or somewhere in between. If you have any questions or comments or concerns about anything that I said in this video, don't hesitate to comment down below, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Hope you have a great day, and I'll speak to you soon.